As always, if any of you are interested in purchasing the Yoon Vortex GMT, then please send me an email or check out my website, which will be in the description below. In my last video, I showed a sneak peek of the new GMT dial that I was working on, and although I found it to be really cool, I later discovered a few things that I wanted to change. One being the gear shape pattern. The initial one was interesting, but for some reason I found it to be a bit too dressy, so I changed it for this new one. It resembles the top-down view of a tornado that satellites often capture, which I found to be quite appropriate for a GMT watch. Not to say that I hope any of you experience a tornado while traveling, and based on this gear shape pattern, I decided to call the watch the Yoon Vortex GMT. The other change I made was the placement of the Yoon logo, which was previously in between the 12 and center of the dial. This is usually where logos go on most dials, but I found it to be a bit disruptive because it ruined the flow of the center gear shape pattern. Thus, the Yoon logo now sits in line with a center ring that separates the gear shape pattern from the markers. I did film more of the behind the scenes stuff of making the dial and the components, and my more detailed thought process of why I did certain things and why I didn't, but this will be posted for my channel members. Thank you to everyone who joined, and I hope you do enjoy the content so far, and if you haven't, then I do encourage you to join. It's mostly vlogs about making certain parts and the really geeky stuff that most of you guys won't care about, I think. Now, of course, one of the main components that I wanted to utilize in this watch is the new Nh34 Movement, which is exactly the same as the 4R34. The 4R34 and Nh34 follow the same naming conventions that I explained in my Everything You Need to Know About Seiko Movements video, so check that out if you're still confused. But back to the Nh34 or the new GMT caliber in general, it's really interesting how Seiko went about developing it. To keep it short, the day complication was basically reworked into a GMT complication. So in my mind, I view it as kind of a modified Nh36 or 4R36 to some extent. In my previous video, I showed how you can utilize Photoshop to make mock-ups or designs on a program before physically going about making it, and a lot of you guys seem to be intrigued by this process. So let's do something different and build the Yoon Vortex GMT through a screen first before going to build it physically. That was super weirdly said, but let's go to the screen now. Bear in mind, this is a computer rendering, so it will never be quite as nice as a physical product, but it does help give an idea of what the overall feel of the watch will be, which is exactly what I'm trying to get out of this. The feel is basically how I come up with most of my designs. It's very scientific, I know. So here is Photoshop opened up, and I'm going to start off with the case, and here is the one that we're going to be using. It's 42 millimeters, but the lug to lug, so the lug to lug here is only 46 millimeters, so it wears much smaller than the dimensions suggest. If I had to compare, it wears very similar to a 40 millimeter Submariner. Not overpowering, but at the same time not too small, because this is going to be a sports watch. And now we can go on to put on the dial, and bear with me, I know it looks funny because the dial is a vector file, but again, I'm just going for the overall feel of the watch. It looks weird because this dial is a vector file and this case is a photo, but again, just the feel. I'll also put on a blue overlay because the dial is going to be some shade of blue, so this will help me get a better idea of how things will look. And now we're going to put on the hands for this watch, and I wanted something that's a bit sharp looking because it might pair well with the style or shape of the indices. So for this watch, here's what I chose. We have the blue GMT hand, hour hand, minute hand, and second hand. And of course, I had to put it in the 1010 configuration. What's left is a chapter ring, which I think I'll go for a fully Lume chapter ring, if I can find it somewhere right here. So a fully Lume chapter ring, and now we need a bezel to go around. Now initially I picked out this smooth brushed bezel for the design, but still I'm not really too sure if I want to go with this plan. I don't know if I should keep it with this smooth bezel or if I should put on a rotating bezel and have either a GMT or dive bezel insert on it. I would develop my own insert on Illustrator, then have it made, opposed to using something that's already out there, but right now that would take a long time for me to develop and prototype, so for the sake of the video, I'll keep this design as is and work on the bezel and the insert in the coming weeks. So I actually did end up making an insert after a few long sleepless nights, and you'll see what I ended up with in a bit, but I just wanted to give an update just in case you guys were wondering why this insert popped out of nowhere. So you can see how super useful it is to be able to make mockups like this through the use of tools like Photoshop and Illustrator. This program is Photoshop and the dial was made through Illustrator, but there are so many type of drawing programs that all follow these same type of rules. But trust me on this, it's quite frustrating to figure out and learn how to navigate through all of the features for beginners. And I'm sure you guys are used to this by now, but that's where our sponsor comes into play, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community of thousands of inspiring classes ranging from photography, illustration, freelancing, product design, and much more. There are tons of classes that teach beginners how to use Illustrator, like Daniel Scott's Essentials training. He goes over all the tools you need and in which scenarios to use them in, which is something I wish I had access to when I first started. There's also classes on Photoshop, which is also a very useful tool because you can combine images of parts and see how a custom watch is going to look like before it's physically built. Again, this is a great tool that can help you decide whether or not you want to use a certain part. So knowing how to use these programs is extremely useful to modders because you can make designs to show yourself, to clients if they ask for some type of rendering, or even to custom part makers because you'll know exactly what you want. The first 1,000 people to use the link in my description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare, so please take advantage of this. Thanks to Skillshare for sponsoring this video, which helps me make videos for you guys. Okay, so with the rendering done, we can go to the bench and actually have the watch made. Here I have the Vortex dial, which is a multi-part construction. The gear shade in the center, GMT numbers going around, raised markers on top for some depth, and all hand finished in a radio satin finish. The base of the dial is in a slightly darker shade of blue, and the raised markers are a bit lighter for added contrast. So the two parts were anodized separately, then later combined together to achieve this look. No paint whatsoever. This grade 5 titanium dial is anodized, which is an electrochemical process that affects the natural oxide layer. It increases corrosion and wear resistance while also adding to the metal's aesthetics. It's mounted onto the Nh34 Movement, and here is the blue Gmt Hand to be installed. Visibility isn't an issue since the dial is quite metallic in appearance, so the almost enamel-like blue on the hand is quite noticeable. Not to mention the big Lume triangle plot at the end that's kinda hard to miss. So after being installed, it's tested to ensure that things are working properly before putting on the other hands. The GMT hand can be adjusted by normal time setting or by pulling the crown to its second position to set it individually, as you can see here. Now I'm sure all of you guys know this, but the GMT hand allows you to track a second time zone, which is quite useful to those who travel often. I'll be needing this since I'll be traveling soon, but none of you guys probably care, so here we are setting the hour hand. As always, I align it up, set it into place, give it a test to make sure it's aligned properly relative to the GMT hand, then give it a clean. This is repeated for the minute hand, except now that the hour hand is the point of reference, then the second hand, which doesn't really matter where you align it up. The process for installing a handset onto a GMT movement is essentially the same as any other movement, except that the spacing between hands is much tighter. So compared to a time-only caliber like the Nh34, there is an additional hand to take note of, which makes everything less forgiving if parts aren't perfectly parallel to each other. By the way, the Nh34 does have hacking seconds, and for sure, this looks much nicer than the Photoshop rendering, but the feel I kept mentioning before is definitely present here. Now the internals are set aside to work on the case parts. The inside is cleaned up, chaptering is put into place, which we'll be visiting again later on, and the crystal gasket is set into place. The crystal of choice is of course sapphire with clear AR coating on the underside, and it's double domed as well. If you're having trouble setting glass evenly, try pushing it in little by little while rotating the case, and make sure that the gasket is perfectly in place before doing anything. Depending on how well your tool is calibrated, this may be unnecessary, but this practice has become a habit of mine despite how much I trust my press. So the sapphire is checked to ensure it's seated evenly, then the internals are put into place after inspecting for any dust and whatnot. Now we're at a stage where I'm not entirely sure how to proceed. That is, I wasn't sure if I wanted to use this smooth satin bezel. It wasn't weird by any means. Actually, it makes for a very clean look that you may actually prefer, but So as I hinted earlier, I did end up making the insert because deep down inside of me, I knew that I would be so much more happier if I did have this part completed and added on to the Vortex GMT. So I went all out to make this watch even more custom and handmade despite the hours of sleep that I've lost. And another warning, I did end up making another change to the final design, which you'll also see in a bit, but sometimes I wonder why I do this to myself. So yeah, I ended up not going for the smooth bezel and decided to have a rotating one instead. So a click spring is put into place, followed by a lubricated gasket that's installed onto the new bezel. I'll explain in a bit why I didn't opt for a bidirectional bezel. Once all prepped up, the assembly is aligned up, then evenly pressed into place and tested for its action in case I need to do any type of tweaking. Onto the crown, which is engraved with my Y logo, and put aside for now to work on the stem. It's cut to size, the bird, cleaned up, lubricated, and married onto the watch itself. We're almost done, so the case back gasket is lubricated and seated into place, followed by this custom case back that I made for the Vortex GMT. The parts are rated for 200 meters of resistance, which is related to the reason why I wanted to have a rotating bezel opposed to a smooth one. So here is the custom bezel insert that I made, finished in radial satin and anodized in a similar dark shade of blue as the base of the dial. It looks really good on the watch, and I chose to have dive markings instead to make the watch effectively a GMT diver. I personally think having 2 time zones displayed on a watch is more than enough, and I also find dive inserts to be much more useful for timing all sorts of things because realistically, most of us don't dive. The Vortex has a very metallic feel to it that I was ultimately going for, but this current configuration is not the final design. Alright, so here it is, the Yoon Vortex GMT finally completed. As you can see, I made one change off camera after seeing the watch fully built, and that was the chapter ring. For some reason, I thought the creamy white hue of the Lume chapter ring didn't fit quite as well as I expected, so I went for a brushed one with the Vortex logo engraved on the bottom. Another custom touch, and I'm pretty happy with the design now. The dial and bezel insert are also in a somber satin finish, so it flows well with the chapter ring finish as well. Of course, this being a part of my Yoon line of watches, I had the Y logo put on the crown and also had a custom case back made. The center shows the same guilloche texture found on the dial, along with the model name, the year it was made, and limited production. To be honest, with the amount of work, time, and energy that goes into making a single watch, I don't foresee myself making this for a long time, so the Vortex will be a relatively short run. The GMT complication is very cool to have, especially after building hundreds of time-only watches, and the dial, I'm super stoked on it. One version of the Vortex that I'd love to see is a base dial with a silver sunburst finish with the apply markers being in a blue finish. It would have this really interesting two-tone look, and if I had more time to make this video, I definitely would have gotten that made. But as of now, I hope someone does commission a Vortex like that so that I can post a photo on my website. And just like the open work that I previously released, the base of the Vortex dial, the markers, and now the bezel insert can be made in an assortment of colors, some of which being bronze, gold, blue, green, purple, and like I said before, even a combination, so like a green base with blue markers, blue and purple, gold and silver. I love that you guys have been ordering the open work in an assortment of colors because it is super interesting to see how each one of them turn out. So I'm even more excited to see what color combinations you guys decide to go for the Yoon Vortex GMT. Alright, with all that said, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing if you haven't already. Like I said earlier, if you want to see more of the behind the scenes stuff, then consider becoming a channel member, which directly supports the channel. Check out the website lume-shot.com to place an order, and also give me a follow on Instagram. It's lume_shot. Alright, I will see everyone in the next video.